This is Anarchast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whatever time it might be. And I'm here on Anarchast. This is your home for anarchy on the internet. I have a really great guest coming on, a very prolific writer and speaker and author. He's written at least 5 books I know of. He used to be the senior editor of the Free American for the John Birch Society. He's highly prolific, mostly lately about the police state on LewRockwell.com. And that's we're really going to talk a lot about the police state amongst other topics as well. We'll get into all sorts of stuff. And if he's anywhere near as prolific in speaking as he is in writing, this might be quite a long episode, but a very interesting one, as he's very, very knowledgeable and has a lot of great perspectives on things. So his name's William N Grigg. And the very first question, though, William, I always have to ask is, how did you become an anarchist?
I really appreciate your generous introduction, Jeff. And the way that I became an anarchist was by trying to understand and apply the Golden Rule. And it seems to me that the Golden Rule is cognate with the non-aggression principle. We, of course, consider ourselves to be indispensable. And the Golden Rule requires that we reciprocate that estimate of other people. And that, of course, in practice is the non-aggression principle as described by libertarians and by anarchists. And I reverse engineered libertarianism, essentially. What is it about libertarianism that I find attractive? And what is it about aggression that I find undesirable? How do I optimize the former and minimize the latter? And it finally dawned on me that the logic of anarchism is irresistible. You don't want to be ruled, so you shouldn't want to be a ruler. And that means that the Golden Rule, which is something that is self-executing without the intervention of a political state, the Golden Rule, I think, mandates that we try to do away with this artificial and murderous construct called the state entirely, to the extent that it's possible. So aspirationally, I became an anarchist a number of years ago, and I've been inspired, as many others have been, by the writings of Tolstoy on the subject. And we have a very powerful counterexample in the form of this metastasizing corporate police state we live under here in the American Soyuz. And the more that I've examined its doings, the more anarchism became attractive to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the first time someone has brought up Tolstoy as being one of their main influences to coming to anarchism. I know you have an interesting past, from what I can tell, that you used to be, I believe, a Mormon, and then you changed into a Christian. And what you just brought up, the Golden Rule, I've talked about this on a few episodes, that I believe Jesus was an anarchist, from what I can tell.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about your perspective on that?
I find it fascinating that as a Christian believer, the one being in the universe that has the right to compel never compelled, as far as we have record in the Gospels, which I consider to be authoritative, and people who don't share my beliefs could certainly profit from the historical sections of the Bible. And as history, it's pretty clear that those who have considered themselves believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have been stateless people to the extent that it's possible. And Abram, later Abraham, the father of the faithful, was a stateless man. And under the reign of the judges, as it's described in the Old Testament, there was no political state. There was a patriarchal order organized around clans. And it wasn't until the aspirations of corrupt and opportunistic people, as described in the book of 1 Samuel, came to fruition that they ended up with what we would now call a political state in the form of a monarchy. And this was a result, according to the record, of the rebellion of Israel. They wanted to be ruled by men rather than ruled by law. And that's sort of the genesis of the Western concept of the state. Now, Jesus, the historical figure, whether you accept him as divine or not, lived as an anarchist. He abided the pretense of the Roman government and their satraps in terms of what they claimed to be, while urging his believers and his followers to resist the temptation to become involved in politics. My kingdom is not of this world, he said. I'm not here to be a ruler. I'm not here to be a political liberator. I'm here to teach you another way of living that has nothing to do with the state. He never paid taxes out of his own proceeds. There was an instant in which he obtained through miraculous means a drachma that he used to pay the toll to get into the temple. But when he was asked about taxation, when he was asked about currency issues, he said essentially, that's Caesar's affair. you don't belong to Caesar. Caesar is entitled to that which is his. And of course, as a believer, what that tells me is that because I don't belong to the state's entitled to nothing.
Yeah, I agree. But of course, it's all gotten twisted, as every single thing always does. And I really haven't looked into it all that much, but I've been asking people these questions. I'm actually getting quite spiritual lately. I've been spending the last 10, 15 years of my life trying to figure out what's going on here on Earth with all these human beings. And I figured out quite a bit.
It's a fascinating study.
Yeah, it's very interesting for sure. And that's why I really don't watch a lot of fiction movies or read fiction books, because I find life more fascinating than most of that stuff. Although it is nice to relax and watch The Matrix or V for Vendetta or The Lord of the Rings, which are all anarchist sort of based movies. Yeah, I find it fascinating. And then, of course, I was just bringing up how a lot of this Christianity stuff has been so twisted. I heard recently, like what you just brought up about what Jesus apparently said about Caesar. A lot of Christians take that to mean that you should respect authority. Have you heard like how they've twisted all that part of it?
Oh, recently. I mean, within the last couple of days, I've been exposed to that. But the Romans 13 church, if you will, the people who consider that to be the lens through which we should view all these interactions, they always assert that the authorities that are established were established by God, ergo we have to defer to them whether what they're requiring of us is morally supportable. And on my reading, that's exactly the opposite of what Paul was saying. Paul was saying that to the extent that authority exists, it comes from God and has to be used for godly purposes, which means it has to be reconcilable with the universal and always relevant golden rule. Nobody is exempt from the golden rule, including those who presume to exercise rule over others. And in talking about matters of authority, Jesus said, if you are the head, you are supposed to be the servant of everybody, rather than the conventional arrangement where the person who calls himself the head requires that everybody serve him. So even in that respect, in private relationships, Jesus was teaching something that was completely the inverse of what most people would assume. And it makes no sense at all to say that the same Jesus who lived that way and taught that way would ordain for his followers a standard of life where we're supposed to be deferring to supposed authority as a matter of course. And the parable of the currency, the famous line about render unto Caesar that which is his, I find that interesting because what Caesar did was he took of nature and created coinage and put his image on it and said, this now belongs to me. And of course, we know subsequently that the coinage, as was always the case, was adulterated, where within a couple of centuries there was just patina at best of actual precious metal within the Roman coinage. And that's a debasing quantity. And what that means is that if you're bought into that system, what you're saying is that you can elevate a ruler above nature and nature's God, and you are authorizing that ruler to keep altering the bargain to his advantage. If you're part of the government's, the state's currency system, for instance, they basically decide what element of value it's going to retain. So that's part of the deal as well. And if you believe, on the other hand, that you're a distinct creation, either of nature or some superintending deity, and that you own yourself, then you realize that really Caesar doesn't get any of it. And if you're a Christian believer, you believe that God owns all of it, but he has generously allowed you to own yourself with respect to your relations with other people. But Jeff, one of the things that is a constant irritant to me, if not a constant source of grief, is this idea that believers have a duty to put their conscience into escrow when they're dealing with the state. Because what the state will do, they will be accountable for, and you will not be accountable for what is done by the state, supposedly in your name. And as far as I can tell, that's one of the most fertile areas of genuine tragedy in human history, is this idea of deferred or alienated responsibility for what is being done in your name. That's one of the reasons why I became such an outspoken opponent of the warfare state a couple of decades ago. You can't say that you're doing this in my name. I'm not part of what you're doing. Think of an epiphany during the bombing of Yugoslavia, when a country that had done no harm to us in any way was being bombed for 78 days. And I was on the telephone at the time talking to people in Belgrade, and they had to interrupt their conversations with me because the air raid sirens were going off. It just finally occurred to me that this monstrosity called the state will simply kill with no defensible reason. And I cannot be party to that. That's where I changed my mind about the death penalty. Now, this government doesn't have the right to kill because it cannot exercise that supposed right in ways that actually defend values that are articulable and worthwhile. And then it occurred to me, finally, tardily, wait a second, all the state does is kill, either implicitly or directly. So if I'm denying the state the authority to kill, why do I act as if the state has any authority at all? And I wish people would have that dialogue with themselves, if you will. I wish they'd confront those questions.
Yeah, and that's a big part of why we do what we do, is trying to bring these discussions to people who haven't heard them before. And in North Carolina, when Ron Paul was in the debates, in the supposed Bible Belt of the U.S., Ron Paul brought up the Golden Rule and got booed by a lot of the audience. It just goes to show just how upside down a lot of people have been turned by all of these things. There was one quote, and I always butcher quotes. I always say that, but the general meaning of the quote, the general meaning of the quote was, for those who have an idea, be prepared for it to be completely misunderstood. And that you can see that with a lot of things that Jesus was saying, and then people who say they believe in Jesus are doing the exact opposite of what he was saying. And it's just terrible. I should just point out briefly, because I am going down this certain path right now where I'm starting to look into all sorts of spiritual sort of angles to things, because I find it also fascinating. I should state, I at this moment in time, I consider myself to be agnostic, and that just generally means that I haven't seen enough proof of anything to truly believe one thing or another at this moment in time. I do know that, or I don't know actually, but I do believe that what they say, for example, the Big Bang Theory, which is supposed to be a scientific explanation for why we're all here and why the universe exists, that's just religion for people who believe in science. There was nothing. We're not religious. We don't believe there's any intelligent being or anything created this universe, but we have the scientific proof. Here's the proof. There was nothing, and then there was a giant explosion, and then there was everything. It's like, okay, that makes no sense whatsoever. So I'm going down this path of just researching and looking into everything. I just find it fascinating. And the more you look, the more, just like when you look into statism or governments or banking, the Federal Reserve, central banking, the deeper you go, the more crazy it gets. But it is very interesting. So I'm very interested in this. And I want to ask one more question, and then I want to get onto the police state a little bit more. But you used to be a Mormon, and then you changed. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened and why?
A lot of that's tied up in my questioning about the nature of authority and the purposes of authority. But the easiest way to describe how I decided that I was no longer a believer in the religion of Mormonism was that I came to know and understand the teaching and personality of Jesus Christ. And I became a believer in him as opposed to a believer in an institution. And I don't think that this is something that would be unique to somebody raised in Mormonism. I think there are plenty of people in nominally Christian denominations who have similar experiences and decide that they need to pare away the incrustations of tradition and institutional privilege and take a look at the teachings of the being whose name is being invoked by whoever runs that organization, and seeking to conform your life to what he taught and try to understand his nature. And so that's the tidiest and, I think, the most effective way, the most incisive way to describe why I decided to leave that tradition and to embrace life as an unaffiliated follower of Jesus of Nazareth, as opposed to somebody who's beholden to a denomination. And I think what you say about agnosticism is interesting, because I consider agnosticism to be honest curiosity, which is, in all circumstances, what I consider to be an unqualified and commendable approach to life. You should have an honest curiosity about everything and ask questions about everything. And approaching the Big Bang Theory or the singularity theory of our existence the way you did, I think, is a really good example of where agnosticism is very useful, because there are a lot of para-religious assumptions about our origins. I have a great deal of respect for Neil deGrasse Tyson. For one thing, he was a collegiate wrestler, and I find that to be entirely honorable. Secondly, he's very witty, and he's a very effective popularizer of science, which I find altogether worthwhile. I saw him responding to somebody who asked a question about the God of the gaps idea. The idea, what existed before the singularity that we call the Big Bang? And what he said is, well, we don't know, but we've got our best people working on it, and we'll let you know what we find out. The problem is that's a self-nullifying answer, because by definition, science can't answer that question. Science is based on observation. And it's the exercise of asking questions and trying to falsify your assumptions about what you observe. That's why it's so useful. You see, if science becomes successful, it eventually becomes engineering. You're applying what you have failed to falsify, and you're building on that basis. But beyond that, it can become a type of mysticism, as when Stephen Hawking, uncomfortable by the fact that his own mathematics leads him to acknowledge a creation point, decides that this is something he has to address as a problem, because that means that if there's a creation point and the universe is structured in a way that brings about intelligent life, sentient life that can ask questions about its existence, then you're talking about something that allows for a personal creator. And in his lecture on that, he said, to address that problem, I've decided to alter the mathematics. And I'm saying, well, you're no longer dealing in science then, because that's not a problem. That's something you've simply observed. You know, you don't adjust the terms of the test because you don't like the results and call it science. And I say that with all due respect for his accomplishments. I think that people who are asking honest questions are to be embraced and commended. I cherish people of that description, however they describe themselves.
Yeah, I find it all fascinating. I don't want to talk too much more about it because
Sure.
to me, anarchy and spirituality, what you believe, are two different things. And I want to focus more on anarchy, but I do find it
Sure.
completely fascinating. And that's why I like to talk about these things a little bit. It's just fascinating. And for people who say they're atheists, I respect anyone's belief, because we don't know. No one knows. I haven't seen any proof of exact this is for sure. But to say that you believe that there is no God or nothing created this, or there's no explanation except for this Big Bang theory, doesn't make any sense either. And the really interesting thing, and this is going to be my final comment before we move on, is you can see actually the scientific community, which is getting a little bit better now. Like there's so many things going on. There's so many advancements going on. You're actually seeing scientists now really who used to be like, well, obviously there's just no God who created us or anything. And a lot of them are getting to the point now where they're like, holy shit, like like the more we look into it, like this had to be created by something, because you can actually look at the mathematics of everything. It's almost like it was designed like a video game a little bit. If you're talking in those terms, like you can see
Sure.
the programming into everything once you look deep enough, and it is fascinating. But let's get off that topic, because I don't want to, when you bring in religion, and what I'm talking about isn't necessarily religion. It's about trying to understand what life is. Religion I connotate with some sort of organization like the Catholic Church or these organized things, which anything organized usually is horrible, or collectivized at least.
Collectivized.
Yeah, collectivized. Yes. That's the best word. But I do find it fascinating, and so I keep looking into it. Yeah, it is fascinating. But now let's get into the hardcore realities of our current existence. You're there in the USSA. I see you talking all the time about the police state, and of course, who can't talk about it at this moment in time? And finally, people are waking up to what's going on in the U.S., especially in the last few weeks in Ferguson. What's been going on? Give us your take on the rise of the police state, what you're seeing, what's going on, and how horrible it is.
One of my formative experiences occurred way back in, if I remember correctly, it would have been 1992, when I was traveling to Philadelphia as part of a performing group, and I was on the turnpike and listening to the radio, and I heard reports that there had been an attack by air on a city block in Philadelphia by the police department that wiped out a group called The Move. I think that was 1992. It was either 92 or 93. And I remember thinking how odd it was that you would have the police actually attacking people using an incendiary munition in a situation where there was no clear reason where these people posed that kind of a threat. And I got to Philadelphia that same day, and this was shoved off the headlines by another disaster, which was the introduction of the new Coke. Actually, forgive me, this is way back in 1985. This is in 1985 that this happened. It was in May of that year. And then 7 years later, here in Idaho, there was the Ruby Ridge standoff. And it was a similar sort of thing where you had a group of eccentrics who were in bad odor with the public because of their irregular beliefs and their supposed white supremacist affiliations. And the first reports we got was that they were involved in trafficking firearms to dangerous people and that they had shot and killed U.S. Marshals. And I remember thinking that people generally don't behave that way. And so I had a certain skepticism about what I was being told, but I was largely receptive to the official story. And over the course of months, we found out that we were being lied to about what had happened and how this confrontation arose. And I also found out that there was an effort to drop an incendiary bomb on the tar paper shack wherein resided the Weaver family, or as they referred to it, the armed compound. You know, whenever they're going to attack your home becomes a compound. It could be an igloo. It could be a wiki-up. It could be a yurt. You know, if the government attacks it, it suddenly becomes a compound. And so they were talking about dropping an incendiary bomb on the Weaver family. I said, well, this is becoming a trend. And then a few months later, we had Waco. And there we saw in real time that sanctuary burning down. And the first reaction of a lot of my pious friends was, wow, it's terrible. Those cultists killed themselves. And at that point I said, forgive me, that's not what I saw. And that's not what I've been reading, not what I've been hearing about. So starting in 1993, at the time I was writing for the Provo Daily Herald in central Utah, starting in 1993, I began to examine what we now call the police state and the militarization of law enforcement. And I did a series back then of 4 or 5 columns called The Saga of a Government Run Amok, where I was compiling some of these high-profile cases. I started working with the New American Magazine that fall, and in, I think it was April of 1994, around the anniversary of Waco, we put out an issue called Toward a Police State, which I think was pretty much the patient zero of this healthy epidemic of concern over police militarization. And one of the topics that we covered in that issue was the transfer of military hardware to police departments and the centralization and federalization of police departments. So I started looking into that issue pretty heavily in 1994. And then after the Oklahoma City bombing, you had the dramatic up-armoring of people in order to deal with domestic terrorism. You also had, in the interval, the COPS Act being passed with the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1994, which was intended to start pumping federal money into local police agencies. And that is a dynamic that we always found troublesome of the New American, which was the expansion of federal control and the commingling of the law enforcement bodies with the military. Now, at the time, I had assumed, as many others had, that there was, if you will, sort of a generic difference between police and the military. That as long as police were locally controlled and civilian in nature, that they were to be embraced, and that the real problem was what the feds were doing.
Wow, I'm really surprised or impressed that you caught on to what's going on with the police state back in the 90s. Most people didn't realize any of that at all, and actually up until today, a lot of people don't realize it, which is really sad. But I've really realized it. I started to notice it definitely after 9/11. But in the last few years, it's just gotten it's totally changed. You saw with the Boston supposed marathon bombing, the entire city of Boston got locked down because there was a 19-year-old skinny kid apparently running around with a rice cooker. Yeah. And so everyone hid in their houses and chanted Boston strong, while the massive police state rolled out with SWAT teams and pointed guns at everyone.
That's the cradle of liberty.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was actually watching that on TV when it happened. I was in New York, and I was actually quite worried because they thought he might be going to New York. And I was like, oh, my God, I got to get out of here before they turn New York into Boston. And then they said, we found him. He's in a boat. And then they found him apparently, and then I was just like looking at my TV in amazement as hundreds or thousands of people that were all there watching all started to chant USA, USA. It's unbelievable. But now we see with Ferguson, Missouri, what's going on. It's very interesting. There was an altercation. We still at this time we really don't know all the facts. We probably never will know all the facts. But there was a police person who got into an altercation with another person, and the other person ended up shot 6 times and dead. And the people there started to get a little bit angry, so that was interesting. And so, of course, the government response was, well, if they're going to get angry about this, then we're going to really roll out and tear gas them and shoot rubber bullets at them and accost them. And then for even a few days, they made them stay in their houses at night. So the response to what looked like possibly was government aggression against a person turned into more government aggression and more oppression. And so what's your thoughts on what's been going on in Ferguson?
Government has one tool, and that's violence. It has one method of operation, and that's aggression. And it has one strategy, and that's escalation. And so what happened after the shooting, however that shooting was precipitated, we don't know for sure. And as you say, Jeff, we're never going to find out for certain, because the only side that has an incentive to find out what happened is, if you will, the partisans of Michael Brown. The police have every incentive not to engage in full disclosure. But however that conflict was precipitated that resulted in the shooting death of an unarmed 18-year-old man, what you had was, first of all, aggressive, contemptuous neglect by the police in dealing with the shooting. That body was left to fester for hours on the streets of Ferguson in front of his family and his friends and his neighbors, many of whom had actually seen the shooting. They didn't see the origins of the fight, but they saw the shooting. No ambulance was ever sent to treat or to recover the body of Michael Brown. And then a few hours after this happened, the chief of police offered a very sketchy and completely inadequate description, saying that there was an encounter that resulted in an altercation.
Well, the interesting thing to me, I don't know if you've heard more on this, that it appears, according to 911 calls and things like that, that the police didn't even know about this shooting apparently for hours, and they found out about it on the news.
Well, they found out about it within a few minutes, but they did find out about it through the media. There were people on the scene. There were police officers on the scene within a few minutes of the shooting. No EMTs, no paramedics were sent. But there were people on the scene from the department to lock down the scene within, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes of the event. But the dispatch call made it clear that the officer who shot Michael Brown didn't call dispatch about the shooting. And the other thing that's really important in this connection, Jeff, is that there was never an incident report filed by that officer. And there was an incident report filed by the St. Louis County Police Department, which took over the investigation 10 days after the shooting. There was an incident report that was created, and it was blank. And it was produced in response to an ACLU demand for the incident report. And one of the first things that police officers are taught when they're cadets is you document everything as near to the event as possible, based on the entirely wholesome assumption that your initial understanding of what happens probably definitive. But they didn't produce a story, which meant that Dorian Johnson, who was the young man in the company of Michael Brown during the shooting, Dorian Johnson was the first person to provide the story, and the story he told is that the police officer drove past and snarled at the two of them in profane language to get on the sidewalk. Johnson replied by saying, "We're almost where we're going," which was his grandmother's house. His story was that the cop hit the brakes on his SUV, backed up the car, nearly hitting them, and then opened the door violently, slammed the door into Michael Brown, caused the door to ricochet back against the police officer. He ended up being shoved back into his vehicle, and then he supposedly drew his gun and threatened to shoot Michael Brown. A struggle ensued. Brown fled, was shot in the back, turned to surrender, and then was fatally shot. That was the version in more or less comprehensive detail that was offered by the primary eyewitness on the scene, and that was the only story we heard. Now, what I think Chief Johnson should have done if he would have been a public servant, first of all, would have been to find out the identity of the shooting victim, and then to contact his family, in this case, I guess his grandmother, and then parents if they're available, and express condolences. That's the decent human thing to do, and that is a moral responsibility that doesn't change just because you're a police chief. Jeff, there was a shooting in Iceland last December, I think it was. The police in Iceland, for the first time in 50 or 60 years, shot and killed a suspect. First time in 50 or 60 years. And in that case, the suspect was holed up on a second story of a building, shooting at cars through an open window. And so police responded to this threat, and then they shot him to defend innocent lives, which is something people are required to do, actually. If you have moral responsibility for other people, you're required to use lethal defensive force if necessary to protect their lives. that's true whether you're a police officer or not. So this was a righteous shoot from everything that I've been able to learn in the media. I haven't been able to travel to Iceland. I'd love to go. It looks like a lovely country. But from everything I've learned, that seems to have been a righteous use of defensive force. The police chief of what I guess is the national police in Iceland called the family of the suspect to express regret and condolences. It's not a gesture of weakness. That's the sort of thing that Chief Jackson should have done. And then he should have gone before the public and been as candid as possible about what had happened, and then asked for patience while another agency investigate the shooting by an identified officer. If he had done that before sundown on that Saturday, we most likely would not have seen riots. We most likely would have seen grief and anger, but it would not have been the sort of thing that would have attracted the opportunistic interests of people who wanted to propagate violence. And of course, that's the sort of thing you do if you understand that you're governed by the non-aggression principle. If, however, you're an agent of this fiction called the state, then your first responsibility is to make people understand that they have to submit to you. And that was the message they started to send on that Saturday and the following Sunday. And it escalated from there to outright counterinsurgency warfare of a sort that left people around the world shocked to see what America had become. And you and I and a number of other people who've been investigating and commenting about this phenomenon over the last several years, we weren't shocked. You know, we were perhaps shocked, I guess, but we weren't surprised. I mean, it's shocking to see that kind of thing happen, but there's nothing about it that was surprising. We knew that that was what lurked beneath the veneer of institutional civility in every police department. We know that's the skull beneath the skin of our civic life. And so what we saw was not surprising. It was something that, of course, left many of us horrified, myself among them. But we've not seen the last of that type of overkill either. What's happened over the last week is that we've seen great pushback from the SWAT lobby. Yes, there is a SWAT lobby, and they sent a letter to Congress last week saying, don't end the 1033 program, the transfer program for the Pentagon. We need all this hardware because we're the last line of defense or the first line of defense, depending upon the rhetorical necessities. And heaven forfend that ISIS would somehow manage to travel here from the Middle East and start wreaking havoc on Main Street. We need these MRAPs. We need the military-grade battlefield-ready armor and weaponry, because ere long, the people who are beheading innocent folks over in Iraq are going to be marching down the streets of our small towns like Ferguson, Missouri, and Payette, Idaho. That's the fiction they're embracing, and there are people who are surprisingly receptive to it, or else it wouldn't have worked for them for so long.
Don't even get me started on ISIS, which was created by the U.S. government. And even that recent beheading, I've just started to look into it. I'm not going to say too much right now. I'm still doing my research, but that was I'm almost certain, completely fake. Anyway, I'll talk about that more later.
I hope it was.
Have you watched it? That's the thing. Here's the thing. Let me explain. I also I've watched beheadings before. I actually forced myself to do it because I want to see what is going on. I want to see. I'm a curious person. I also want to open myself to everything that's going on, and it is horrible. Like that's probably the worst thing I've ever seen is someone being beheaded, and I've actually seen real ones, and I can't think of anything worse. It's just unbelievably horrible, and I've seen real ones. And so when I heard about this most recent one, I was just like you. For the first 3 days, I was like, I should watch this. This is part of not only my job, but part of what I am to want to know exactly what's going on in every place, and that's the only way that we can start to figure out some sort of solutions or anything like that. But just like you, I didn't watch it for days, and then finally a few people I trusted, anarchists, started to say, I watched the video, this thing is totally fake. And after I saw enough of those, I said, okay, I'm going to sit down and watch it. And you know what? They don't even show the beheading. Not many people know this. A lot of the people that are freaking out about it haven't watched it. I'm going to talk more about it later, but definitely watch it because there's nothing gory about it at all. They don't show the beheading. They show this speech, which is really weird, and it's filmed in Ultra HD from different camera angles, like it was done in a studio. And then they go black, and then they just show his head on top of his body, which looks totally fake. There's no blood or anything. And anyway, I'm going to comment more on it as I do my research. But anyway, definitely watch it because you're going to, nothing gory at all about it. But getting back to the police state,
Of course, government always has the incentive opposite of the free market private enterprise. They always want to grow their bureaucracy. If you're in private enterprise and you have a department in a company, your goal is always to make that department the most profitable, which means to make it as efficient as possible, so the least amount of workers for the most amount of productivity. That's always your general goal in most operations, unless it's a totally monopoly, fascistic sort of a major giant corporation or something like that. But any normal business, that's what you'd want to do. But with government, their incentive is to grow their department as big as possible. So with what happened in Ferguson, I think it was generally done for that reason. They left that man's body on the street for hours in front of all of his neighbors and friends and family. I think they did that in a way just because they wanted to provoke a reaction. And then once there was a reaction, it was quite peaceful at first. A lot of very, what you would expect, a lot of grief, a lot of a peaceful protest. And then the state rolled in with this huge war machine, which really provoked a lot of people. And that's when they started to go a little crazy, which is understandable. Being faced with what looks like a complete army and SWAT gear and snipers and grenade launchers and tanks. And then a few people started looting, which does happen in chaotic situations at times. But the police did nothing to stop that, of course. Absolutely nothing.
Of course not.
So, for the statists out there who say, oh, we need police for situations like that, they caused it. The cause of it was all their activity. The looting was generally a result of their action. They did nothing to stop it. In actuality, the looting was mostly quelled by the local citizens, many of them who were armed and protected their own property. And then the more people started to protest, and then they really rolled in and started shooting them with rubber bullets. And it was hilarious watching the accounts because there was so many independent journalists on the scene actually live streaming, which I found really amazing. This is a great new technology that we have, that there was so many people watching what was going on. And so they'd be standing there, they'd say things like, yeah, the protesters so far are totally peaceful, and the police are sort of just inciting them all over the place, running in and trying to arrest somebody and for no reason, and then it sort of whips the crowd into a frenzy. And what they'd say is, oh, a water bottle has just been thrown at the police. like they're standing there with those shields and all their gear, and they look like football players, essentially, like it's a water bottle. And the reporter would say, oh, here comes the police response, and it'd be like rubber bullets and running in and pointing guns at everybody. I think they kind of want this, because what's going to happen in Missouri now is the police department's going to get a much bigger budget, because of course it's necessary, because look what happened. So it's all the incentives of government is always the opposite. And I saw that personally. I'm originally used to live in a place called Vancouver, Canada, and we have a hockey riot every time the Vancouver team loses in the Stanley Cup Finals. I was there for the first one, and then the last one I wasn't there, but I knew that was going to happen because I know what the mentality is like up there. And so they lost in Game 7, and there was a big riot. But I was watching it, and the riot really wasn't too bad. It was a bunch of angry kids, and people were drunk, and there was a few store windows smashed by idiots. But then the police rolled in, and there's actually evidence that the police lit one of their police cars on fire, and then they really rolled in and started causing havoc and chaos.
Well, Jeff, there was an episode captured on tape that you're well aware of up in Canada during, I think, one of the
G20 or something.
Meetings of the G20, where you had a group of provocateurs who were police agents, who were wearing police-issued boots, who were identified as provocateurs, and then they were arrested on camera in one of the least persuasive bits of performance art since the last WrestleMania. And so it's not a matter of paranoid hypothesis to say that police see these demonstrations with provocateurs. That's something we've been able to document. There was an incident in Albuquerque just a few months ago. Albuquerque, of course, has been absolutely riven with anger and frustration because of their very bloodthirsty police department there. There's been a whole string of at best dubious or facially unjustifiable police shootings, including that poor homeless guy who was surrounded by a SWAT team and then gunned down at a distance because he supposedly pulled a penknife. And at one of the protests staged by people demanding police accountability, there was an undercover operative from the police who was one of the officers being investigated for a facially unjustified use of force, if not several. So he had dressed himself up as a protester, and he was in the crowd helping to incite them and to keep tabs on them. And this, of course, reflects the perverse incentives you describe, and it also reflects what the deathlessly, immortally wise Frederick Bastiat said back when he was a parliamentarian in 19th century France about how government increases its power through a process of creating the poison and the antidote in the same laboratory. And the police were deliberately provocative in Ferguson. He started out with aggressive, contemptuous neglect, and then it very quickly escalated into a conspicuous saying, "Bring it on, you effing animals." That was before you actually had people looting or hurling Molotov cocktails or otherwise threatening private property. And the property owners in Ferguson found out very quickly that it is not the job of the police to protect them, and it's never their job. The police do not protect private property. They serve the interests of those who have license to plunder property. Obviously, they're not going to be good at protecting that, which at best they're preserving to be harvested by the people who pay them. We don't pay the police. They're paid by the people who steal from our paychecks and steal from our property in the form of taxes. And so when you have a situation like what erupted in Ferguson because of state action that is at best very dubious, what you have is a display here of the utter uselessness of the state as an enterprise for protecting property. Because when property was actually imperiled, the police did nothing to help those who wanted to preserve it, and they were objectively on the side of the people who were hurling Molotov cocktails. You'd see many sites in Ferguson over the last week and a half, many incidents in which you'd see somebody hurl a Molotov cocktail, and the police would come in and start firing CS canisters at the same targets. You know, the people that are trying to burn down the homes leave, and then the police come in, and the police shoot tear gas at the homes that have been attacked by the looters. They're on the same side. They're united, you're unified by their shared contempt for private property.
Yeah, and the other really interesting thing I've noticed is that there was numerous YouTube videos, numerous independent journalists. One was Infowars, where they saw someone trying to light someone's house on fire,
Yes.
and they actually tried to stop them. And a lot of the people from around there tried to stop them, but the police weren't there trying to stop them at all. And so what's it going to take for people to realize who the true problem is here? Because when you see man on the street interviews in Ferguson, a lot of them will say, we need to get more involved in the political system. We need to start voting. But on the other side, though, I am seeing hints that people are starting to wake up. You see a lot of people saying as well, this isn't a racist thing. This is a problem of the government versus the people. But they haven't fully realized that the way you fix that isn't by voting. Although it is possible that if everyone voted in fairly anarchist candidates, that things could change politically. It is possible. But I think they're kind of missing the whole point in that we don't need government. Government does nothing but ruin things. There's no positive benefits of government except for certain people who receive certain largesse from them. But in general, they solve no problems, and they create most of the problems we have in the world today.
Yeah, the only thing that government makes are criminals out of innocent people and corpses out of living human beings. And quite frankly, we can live without that. One of the things that you and I are both worried about, Jeff, is the possibility that this is going to be channeled into the familiar collectivist conduits where people are supposed to pick a side based on melanin content. And we're seeing very pitched efforts on both sides of that dialectic to get people to think in those terms. They're finding traction. It's amazing some of the letters I've gotten, some of the emails I've gotten over the last week from people who say, I'm usually on your side where the police are concerned, but this is a different case. How is this different? How is this different? The police have not provided any evidence to justify the shooting of this young man. And now we see this being taken into a process where the assumption is that the shooting was justified. That's the default assumption when the police kill somebody, because of this mystical quantity called qualified immunity. They're entitled to do that. Under Missouri law, take a look at Chapter 563 of the Missouri Revised Statutes. Police are identified as privileged aggressors. Think about that for a second. They're supposedly given license to commit aggression. When they use lethal force, it's presumptively right until we can prove that it wasn't right to use lethal force in that situation.
And who proves it? So, they do, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I'm convinced that Darren Wilson is not going to face criminal charges, at least not state or county charges. I'm convinced that the grand jury is going to no-bill him, and I'm convinced that what's going to happen is that the federal Justice Department is going to step in, which is not going to make things better, because that will suddenly transpose the whole thing into purely an issue of racial justice rather than a question of whether individual justice was done in this case. And that's exactly the narrative they're trying to impose upon us. And it works. And then the other thing that I found, and I made reference to ISIS a little bit earlier, is that this orchestrated or opportunistic, take your pick, episode of the last week involving the reported beheading of this American journalist has allowed the people in charge of the state to give us a new reason to expect further enhancement of their enforcement mechanism. We have to be protected from this distant and somewhat cartoonish external threat. And I've actually started getting emails from some of my correspondents saying, well, you know, Islamic Jihad's the real danger here, whatever happens in Ferguson. Well, Islamic Jihad is not a danger any more than, for instance, a doomsday asteroid perhaps is a more plausible threat. And when you talk about the way that this video of the reported killing seems to be staged, I found myself, sci-fi geek that I am, incorrigible nerd that I've become, I find myself thinking about Iron Man 3 and the Mandarin and how he was a British actor who was paid to play an Islamic terrorist mastermind. And I think that this fellow, who's the supposed spokesman for ISIS, who's been identified as a British citizen, I think he may be the same type of a personality.
Oh, no, there's a lot of evidence, actually. Edward Snowden released some information which was reported quite widely in independent media, not on mainstream media, of course, that he actually was trained by the U.S. government. He was a Mossad agent, and he was trained for this purpose. No, they create, like you said, they create the problem, and then they come up with a solution, and the solution is tyranny and more theft, taxes, and more violence, yes. Wars, and police state.
The answer is tyranny. What's the question?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Do you have any thoughts on what's going to happen over the next few years? Is this going to get worse and worse, or is there some idea that some cause for some hope?
Well, about a year ago, I said, I think we're reaching peak jackfruit, meaning that threshold at which the public's equivalent of a moral gag reflex is going to be triggered. And I think that's happened in Ferguson. I think that in terms of public acceptance of unaccountable displays of grotesque overkill and bullying violence by the police, I think we probably reached a surfeit here, reached saturation point. But that doesn't mean institutionally things are going to change right away. I mentioned the pushback being made by the police militarization lobby. That is a huge and very formidable adversary. We can't expect that the denizens of the Beltway are going to be more receptive to the pleas of the public they supposedly represent than they would be to the politically protected corporate interests who give them job security. And we're also going to see a new militancy on the part of police unions. Just within the last couple of weeks, there's a movement that sprung up to defend Daniel Pantaleo, who's the individual who choked to death Eric Garner on the streets of New York City, Staten Island specifically, because Garner supposedly had been selling untaxed cigarettes. He choked this guy out, and the reason why he choked the guy out was because Garner said, "Stop harassing me, this ends today." He asserted self-ownership. He was behaving like a man who deserved to be left alone. That's unconscionable. That's intolerable. You have no right to speak that way to your costume betters. That's the logic, such as it is, of the NYPD. So after that death was ruled a homicide, which of course it was, the police unions have started to conduct solidarity campaigns to display their support for Daniel Pantaleo, whose most notable accomplishment was to choke to death a harmless, non-violent 43-year-old man on the streets of Staten Island. That happened before Ferguson. And I've seen that the Legal Defense Fund for Officer Wilson has collected a couple of $100,000 by now, most likely. Last I heard it was about 150 grand. Probably by the end of the day, it'll be a couple of 100,000. People are holding support rallies for this man. If you listen to conservative media, and of course I have to, I live in Idaho, remember. If you listen to conservative media, the narrative that you've gotten over the last couple of days is that this hulking black teenager nearly beat this cop to death before he heroically put the guy down. And that was based on a false report out of St. Louis that Officer Wilson had suffered an orbital fracture of his left eye. And we now know that's not true. But the narrative here is that the most dangerous thing is not the state. The most dangerous thing is somebody else from whom the state's going to protect us. And they'll keep flogging that narrative in order to prosper the interests of the police militarization lobby, although it appears that there's a great deal of public opposition to it. So in the immediate term, Jeff, I think it's going to get worse. I think it'll get dramatically worse, as a matter of fact, before it gets better. And I think the reason it'll get better is because there's going to be an economic collapse. They're no longer going to be able to pay the Praetorians. And so then instead of having something like the Praetorian Guard, we'll have little pockets of people who are habituated to living through plunder. They'll be like the Condottieri after the 30 Years' War in Europe, where after serving as mercenaries for various royal houses, they were just let loose to prey on the countryside. That's how we ended up with piracy as a problem in the 17th and 18th century. These people had been corsairs, they'd been privateers, and once the war was over, they decided to go into business for themselves. We're probably going to see that happen over the next 5 or 6 years as well, as some of these police departments end up having, because of the economic collapse, having their budgets cut, and they're no longer able to rely on the largesse of the Pentagon. They'll start living off the land. So that's going to be interesting as well. So I think you're wise to expatriate yourself to Mexico, where there's no pretense that those people are actually serving your interests. I lived in Mexico for a while. I saw how Mexican law enforcement operates. I was in Guatemala during a military coup. I've seen what it's like when the military is conducting itself as an occupying army, and I'm seeing both of those things happen here in the United States to an extent that I never saw when I was living south of the border or in Central America.
Yeah, that's a great point you brought up, and that is why I have defected from. I'm originally from Canada. I spend most of my time in Mexico now because, yeah, it's a lot different down here. People have no expectation that cops are good, that government is good. In fact, the president of Mexico rarely comes to Acapulco because usually he'll be attacked so much or booed. And same thing with the police. The police has been armed by the U.S. government for the most part, and this heinous war on drugs, which is also now ending. So there's a lot of really good things going on in that the state is collapsing. They can't keep up this war on drugs any longer either. And I think once people start to see that go away, they'll start to wonder, well, why do we need government? The whole reason was because of these people doing drugs and these gangs that make a lot of money off of selling them drugs who cause a lot of problems. But down here in Mexico, getting back to Mexico, if a cop does go in and shoot up a house which has a lot of plants in it called marijuana or coca leaf extract, the entire community will usually go after the cop. They'll even they'll burn down the police station. In some cases, in the state where I am, which is called Guerrero State, which means warrior, they still have that little bit of that Aztec thing down here, and they still have that belief of self-ownership. And in some cases, they'll even kill the mayor. And then you'll see up in the U.S., and believe me, I'm not for violence in any form, but I do understand, and actually, I'd rather live amongst people who think that way rather than completely submit to the police and the government and them just doing all the murdering and all the theft. But then you see in the U.S., people will go, oh, that's terrible down in Mexico. They just killed the mayor in this town. What sort of horrible, chaotic place is that? And they'll use the word anarchy. And in a sense, they're kind of using it correctly. It is a bit of anarchy. Of course, the problem's all caused by the state. If there was no state, there wouldn't be these problems. But it's amazing how people in the U.S. are so skewed to think that the government and the police, so many believe those are a good thing. And but I think they're waking up. And so with the internet, thanks to the internet and people like yourself writing vociferously on the internet, on LouRockwell.com, I see you're almost a few times a week writing stuff, and really great stuff. If you haven't read it, check it out.
Thank you.
people are waking up. It's just going to be an interesting transition here from this heinous system of massive government that's grown up in the U.S. and in other parts of the world, and it all collapsing at the same time that people do have access to information. So, yeah, there's a ton of positives, but a lot of negatives about what's going to happen in the future, and you just got to be careful. I asked a few of our listeners or viewers before this interview if they had any questions for you, and they wanted to ask you what it's like to live in Idaho. Is it better? Because people in the U.S. are looking for places.
When I talk about when I talk about my country, I usually mean Idaho. And I'm thinking specifically of the faces I saw over my cradle and the faces I expect to see when I'm on my deathbed. Those are my people. Those are my country. And for the most part, they live here in Idaho or over across the Snake River in Malheur County, Oregon. Idaho is a wonderful place for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it's full of people who really dislike government. Unfortunately, there are some who just dislike certain kinds of government run by certain people. This is one of the reddest of the red states. It's very Republican. And that has its drawbacks, not the least of which is the fact that they want to sanitize the government, make it work on behalf of good, wholesome values, which is why in Oregon you have medicinal marijuana, but in Idaho you do not. You don't even have permission to get so-called Charlotte's Web type cannabis oil to treat Dravet syndrome. We've got people here in Idaho who suffer from severe childhood epilepsy who could benefit tremendously from cannabis oil that's not hallucinogenic in any sense, not psychoactive. But we have a zero tolerance policy for that because of the state legislature. And so you do have, unfortunately, a political system here which is very much state-focused and very puritanical. On the other hand, if you go to the northern part of the state, you run into a lot of people who go there because they want to be left alone. If you go into the Panhandle, everybody knows about the white supremacists. I think there are about 24 of them. I think I know them all by name. They're, for the most part, harmless. There are a lot of retread hippies. There are a lot of deadhead-type people up there. I'm perfectly happy in their company. If you go to southeastern Idaho, where I was born and raised, you have a lot of people who are constitutionalist in their outlook, but are surprisingly receptive to the message of anarcho-capitalism. The late George Hansen, of blessed memory, he passed away a week ago yesterday, was from that part of the country. He was from Pocatello. It turns out I met my birth mother. She's in Pocatello now. I met her just a year ago. I didn't know until then that I'm Hawaiian and Cherokee rather than Mexican. I always thought I was Mexican, but it turns out I'm Hawaiian, Cherokee, and then Irish and Basque. You know, there are not a lot of privileged cohorts in that ethnic composition, I guess. But southeastern Idaho is full of people who will invoke the Constitution and who take it seriously, and who, for the most part, can be approached by people who are individualists or minarchists or anarcho-capitalists, and they can have a pleasant conversation. So if you're interested in living in a state that's got relatively low load in terms of the political structure, and where if you speak the language of individualism, you're not going to be looked upon as a freak or as a potential criminal, Idaho would be a pretty good choice.
That's interesting. So yeah,
come out and check it out.
Yeah.
And we've got silver mines here too. We've got all kinds of wonderful natural resources, but there's plenty of silver in the ground out here, and that's what brought what brought people to Idaho in the first place. One thing I want to say very briefly: you talk about applied anarchism. Back when Idaho was a civilized place, that is to say, before we ended up with the government, you had mining camps that policed themselves. You had laws that were followed and property claims that were enforceable, but you didn't have a government. And then the government came along and ruined this state of affairs. And here in Payette County, there's a fellow by the name of William McConnell. He migrated here from the Midwest. He was a shopkeeper. And like a number of other people, who's being preyed upon by a group of road agents or horse thieves, however you want to characterize them. They were working with the Ada County Sheriff, a man by the name of David Updike. So what William McConnell did was he organized a private security force called the Payette Vigilance Committee, or the Payette Vigilantes. And things transpired to where they eventually tracked down and put the sheriff on trial, and they hanged him because he had been involved in murdering people and stealing their stuff. And then they disbanded the Payette Vigilantes, and unfortunately William McConnell went into a less reputable line of work. He became a governor of the state of Idaho. But there's that tradition here in Idaho as well. There's the tradition of the coiled rattlesnake saying, as long as you leave me alone, you'll be okay. We'll get along just fine. And eventually you get pushed too far, and then you organize spontaneously. You take care of the problem, then you disband and go back to more productive living. And so that's something I think we're going to see revived here in this country. We've seen that happen, as you mentioned, in Mexico. Mexico actually is a really good example of how applied anarchy can work for the provision of security. There are arrangements of that kind coalescing in Detroit, which is an economic moonscape. And it's precisely because the government has to retract that private life is expanding, and it includes private security arrangements. So these things can be handled without dealing with the fully panoplied spectacle of people kitted out in military gear telling us to stay in our homes and then acting with extreme prejudice if somebody among the mundane population dares so much as to look upon them. We don't have to live that way, is what I'm saying, and Idaho might be one of those places where we'll see a different model of living emerge. I certainly hope so. I'm doing my best to help bring it about in any case.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think I've been to Idaho. I was in Spokane for the Silver Summit. Can you drive like an hour to go to Idaho from there?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's with an easy driving distance.
I go every year for the Silver Summit. I'll be there again this year in October. And I call it Spokompton. It's kind of like a really crappy town and police everywhere.
I read what you wrote about that.
And the only...
How dare you have a drink?
And so it was like 1 a.m. and all the bars were closing in Spokane because of government regulation. And someone said, in Idaho, bars are allowed to stay open later, like till 3 or 4. And I didn't feel like going home. And there was a strip club called The Line, I believe, and it's called The Line because it's right on the border between Washington and Idaho. And so you just cross the border and all of a sudden you can have a drink again. It was probably the worst strip club I've ever been to. And actually, I think they made me sign some sort of a contract when I entered that I wouldn't touch any girls or anything. It was really bizarre and weird. But anyway, so I have been to Idaho. And of course, I am here in Mexico. We're going to actually have a conference in late February 27th to March 1st. We haven't totally announced it yet, but it's called Anarchapulco. And we're going to have a lot of anarchists come down here. It's going to be great. And so you're very welcome, of course. And if people want to see sort of the sort of lifestyle here in Acapulco, I call it the most anarchic city in North America, and that's why I'm here. Most people just handle their own problems. Hardly anyone pays any taxes. They don't like taxes. Even property tax here is the property tax here is hilarious. You can have like a $10 million villa, and there's a lot of rich people here. A lot of the rich Mexicans all have villas here, and there is a lot of rich Mexicans. The property tax on like a $10 million villa will be like $200 a year. And you'll hear everyone complaining about it. Like, what am I getting for this $200? Nothing. These criminals.
Well, nothing.
These criminals.
It's not the
point. So it's great. So we're going to be doing that. And hopefully people come down. So let's wrap this up. I could talk to you for quite a long time. But people can't listen too long nowadays. They've got... ADD plus anyone in the U.S. has to pretty much work about 16 hours a day just to survive and pay all their taxes and just to get by with the inflation caused by the central banks. So, William, why don't you...
Cue Lee Greenwood.
Yeah. So why don't you let people know where they can read more of your writing, your books, anything else that you want to let people know?
Yeah, my primary outlet is my blog. It's called Pro Libertate, and you can find it at freedominourtime.blogspot.com. That's one word, freedominourtime.blogspot.com. And you mentioned Lew Rockwell in his blog, lewrockwell.com. That's L-E-W and then Rockwell as in Norman Rockwell. And he republishes a lot of my material from Pro Libertate. I also contribute to the blog section of that website. It's on the right-hand margin of the page. But my primary point of contact is still Pro Libertate. If you go to freedominourtime.blogspot.com, at the bottom of every page, there are links to my weekly podcast, which is called the Freedom Zealot Podcast. And then I also do a daily radio commentary for a Christian radio network called the Liberty Minute. And it's my way of introducing that underserved audience to the tenets of anarchism, quite frankly. And there are links to that as well at the bottom of every essay. And then there's a PayPal button for those who want to make donations. At the bottom of every essay and at the right-hand margin of every page, there's also a Bitcoin button there too. And this is, if you will, a crowd-funded, such as the crowd might be, crowdfunded enterprise and independent journalism. I'm a freelance reporter in the best sense of the expression. I'm beholden to nobody, and unfortunately that means that I'm consistently paid by nobody as well. So I'm sort of the paladin of the keyboard here, and if you're interested in helping out, once again, freedominourtime.blogspot.com, and at the side of every page, the right-hand margin at the bottom of every essay, there's a PayPal button.
That's great. And for all the anarchists out there, try to support other anarchists who are doing great things. And William's definitely sounds like he's doing tons of great things. So if you see some stuff you really like that he's doing, tip a little bit on Bitcoin, and it all helps. Just so you know, William, I actually make money with what I do because of... what I did was I started the Dollar Vigilante, which has become quite popular. And
very familiar with it.
Yeah, and then I have a newsletter where I tell people how to escape from this status situation, how to protect their assets. And it's formed a number of different companies, including TDV Passports, helping people get passports, TDV Offshore, getting their money offshore, and TDV Wealth Management, where we help really wealthy people to internationalize their assets. And so
worthwhile undertaking.
Yeah, so we actually make money, and we actually do pay people when they contribute articles that we use on our site. And so please, whenever you write an article, please send it off to me. And if we use it, we pay for that. So it's not a massive amount of money, usually about $150, but that doesn't hurt. Buys you.
That's considerable.
Yeah. So
it's interesting. So what you're doing is you're a profiteer for the corporate deserter class, right? You're undermining our economic patriotism. God bless you for it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I always laugh when people say, "Oh, these people, that's terrible. They're trying to get their money outside the U.S. so they don't have to pay taxes." It's like, well, that's good.
Sure.
Why would you want to support this, the most tyrannical and horrible terrorist organization on this planet called the U.S. federal government? So I'm doing my best. We'll see how long it lasts, see how long until they shut me down, but I'm going to keep going until they do. So I'd like to thank William. A great conversation. Definitely check out what he does. Check out all his stuff. And that's it for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
This is Anarchast.